Timber Talks is brought to you by WoodSolutions. Stay up to date with the latest in timber, the building material that is strong, safe and sustainable. Here is your host, Adam Jones.
Recently there have been changes in the National Construction Code with the 2019 version just being released. So now there's new responsibilities placed on the engineer, the architect and the certifier, and also new opportunities for different building types. So we're going to be taking a two-part series. Today we're going to be speaking with Paolo Lavisci, the Program Development Manager at WoodSolutions, and Boris Iskra, the National Codes and Standards Manager at Forest and Wood Products Australia, all about the deemed to satisfy provisions in the new construction code. In the next episode, we're going to be exploring the performance solution which is required to get the exposed timber for your buildings. So without any further ado, we'll get into the interview with Paolo and Boris.
Look, in Australia, we have our National Construction Code that basically sets out all the requirements for general building. It covers everything from structural performance, acoustics, thermal, as well as fire. So there's a whole range of things that the code covers. And so all our buildings need to achieve the requirements in the code. In Australia, we have two codes, one for domestic housing and then one for other types of buildings, commercial buildings, apartments, hotels, retail, etc. And that's the main one that we focus on when we talk about mid-rise timber buildings. And
what is the general direction of the codes over the last few decades in terms of increasing quality in buildings?
Look, in terms of quality of buildings, that's probably more as a market issue, and it's the people that administer the code who look after the application of the code in the marketplace. But the code itself, I suppose, has gone through a number of transitions, particularly in relation to timber construction. So the National Construction Code Volume 1 looks after buildings from what's Class 2, which are apartment type buildings, through to Class 9 buildings, which are schools, hospitals, aged care facilities. From a timber perspective, the first code change we had in Australia was around 1994. At that time, there was a very large research project that was undertaken by the industry, just looking at apartment buildings. So in 94, the code change that came in enabled us to build 3-storey timber-framed apartment buildings. Before that, you couldn't use timber construction. The code then started to introduce another pathway. So the code today, you can either do a building design using a performance solution, which requires people like fire engineers, architects, building surveyors to discuss particular projects and come up with a solution that meets the performance requirements of the National Construction Code. The other pathway is what's termed a deemed to satisfy, which is basically like a recipe. Follow the recipe and you're automatically approved. Yeah. So the timber industry, probably over a period of 6 to 8 years, did a whole lot of research work which included fire testing, as well as fire risk analysis and assessments, which led to a code change in 2014. What that code change enabled the industry to do, in terms of the timber industry, was to enable its products to be used in buildings up to what's termed 25 metre effective height. That 25 metres is measured to the topmost floor of the building. And that change was able to be used for Class 2, 3 and 5 buildings, which are apartments, hotels and office buildings. So further work, so that came in 2016. Yeah. In what's coming in 2019 will be ability to use these, what are termed fire protected timber building elements. So basically at the most sort of rudimentary level, it's timber with fire grade plasterboard linings either side to protect the timber structure. So as of 1st of May 2019, you'll be able to build any building you can think of, up to typically about 8 stories, out of timber construction, both in lightweight, which is our traditional timber framed construction, or these massive panels, which include cross-laminated timber, laminated veneer lumber, etc. So something that's got a minimum thickness of 75 millimetres, but more like a panelised element.
And Paolo, what changes did you see in the market after the 2016 code changes? What kind of happened around Australia after that?
After that, Forest and Wood Products Australia, under the brand WoodSolutions, started an advisory activity, which I am part of. And this meant that we have been for almost 3 years meeting design teams, architects, engineers, fire consultants, acoustic consultants, and also developers and builders, of course, to look at their project and see whether they can be a good candidate for timber construction, leveraging the many advantages that the code change and the intrinsic nature of timber construction can bring to their project in terms of speed of construction and safety of construction, less noise, less disruption to the existing tenancies, for instance, in a vertical extension. So we did work really on a big number of projects, and when we started, there was still a mindset to be overcome about timber construction into the mid-rise space. And then there was so much interest and willingness to understand and check the feasibility in real life that after 3 years we are really proud to say that at least 15 projects have come to life. Some of them have been constructed already, some of them have been through the tender and they are post-tender, and others are anyway approved. So at least 15 we can count are just considering Victoria, because we had Victoria as a pilot test area for this program. This project have been built with satisfaction from all the stakeholders, and more are coming now.
And Boris, you mentioned if you go down the deemed to satisfy route, one of the common questions I'm sure you get is about the fire. So how do you achieve the fire performance, and what fire performance needs to be achieved for, say, Class 2 buildings that were brought in the changes in the 2016 changes?
In order to get a change to the code, what you need to be able to demonstrate is that you achieve similar performance or the same performance to traditional forms of construction that were already deemed compliant under the code. So the work that was done by the industry was doing a whole lot of fire risk modelling work, as well as the testing. So there's a whole lot of fire test work, full scale, that was done that fed into the model to show that the timber systems were at least as safe as traditional forms of construction, if not safer. The 2016 changes, with the introduction of the fire-protected timber systems, I suppose, sorry Adam, one of the thoughts that came to mind is talking about why 25 metres was used as the benchmark. The code, that was a quite clear delineation in the code. So up until the change in 2016, you could build a steel or concrete apartment building up to 25 metre effective height, so 8 stories, with no sprinklers. The timber industry sort of said, okay, well, one of the ways to alleviate some of the concerns, the potential comments that people have in terms of combustibility, was to introduce sprinkler systems. So that basically took that off the table, and we worked closely with key stakeholders, including the fire authorities throughout Australia, prior to our original submission. So a whole series of meetings were held with fire authorities around Australia, and we spoke with them to say, okay, what would be the sorts of things we need to address to enable you to feel comfortable with using timber construction. So there are probably over 200 comments that were received, and they were all compiled and addressed as part of our submission. So the 25 metre effective height was just a clear break in the code. So that's the option that the industry took. So the timber building systems are fully sprinkler protected throughout. They have fire protective grade coverings, so typically fire grade plasterboard on the walls and the ceilings to provide that protection to the timber. If there's any cavities within the wall space. And traditionally, when we think of cavities, you've got two timber-framed walls. So one wall for one apartment, the other wall for the adjacent apartment, and there's usually a cavity between those two timber-framed walls. So at the top and bottom of the walls, we have cavity barriers as well as the ends of the walls. And that's to contain the fire spread to that building element in the event that the fire somehow got into the wall system. And that was in direct response to the fire brigades, who said, if we get into a building, we don't want to have to worry about where the fire is and not chase it up a couple of stories. So these fire cavity barriers are there to restrict any movement of fire in the event it got into a wall, which is highly unlikely it would do so, but it's just an additional measure that was put in there to provide that extra layer of safety and comfort, particularly to the fire services.
And Paolo, in terms of achieving the required acoustic performance, what requirements are in the code, and how does Timber Systems meet these acoustic standards?
Actually, the deemed to satisfy rules go quite well also in providing most of the design approach that you need to comply also with the basic acoustic requirements in the NCC. Sometimes a design team or a client specify higher standards following the prescription of the Australian Association of Acoustic Consultants, but the baseline is provided by the deemed to satisfy rules, which also provide a baseline and a clear good start for the fire engineering, because fire engineering is meant to provide the same safety performances but with a different approach from the deemed to satisfy. And this is possible, but when you have a baseline to compare with, it's much easier for a design team to prove what they need to prove and use some of the details which are deemed to satisfy combined with other details which use the charring rate or other fire engineering tools in order to show what they need to show in terms of safety. So actually, the DTS rules are very effective, have been very effective in changing the mindset of people, establishing a baseline which is a common level for fire and acoustic to start with, and from then to progress and improve according to the specified levels.
I was just going to add, with Paolo sort of talking about the ability to meet those acoustic performances, and one of the interesting things that came out of all the work that we'd done was that if you can achieve the acoustic performance, you'll most likely also achieve the fire performance. So the timber systems, in their nature, are lightweight, so they're up to a third the weight of a concrete equivalent concrete system, and because they are lightweight, you actually need to add a little bit of mass to those elements, and that extra mass helps you achieve is used to achieve the acoustic requirements. So it almost goes hand in hand. When we did the analysis work, fire engineering wise, we found that it was the acoustic provisions that were driving the systems, not the fire, which is quite an interesting an outcome of the work.
Definitely. And in 2019, this year, there's been additional code changes, which you briefly mentioned. What are some of the changes?
Yeah, look, I mean, basically with the fire-protected timber systems, so our timber structures with fire-grade linings, as of 2019, you'll be able to build, 1st of May 2019, you'll be able to build whatever building you can think of out of timber. So I suppose the key focuses will be things such as Paolo was referring to, vertical extensions on buildings. So if you've got an existing office building, you could put an extension of timber office building on top, or you could put some retail in timber with some apartments above. So it gives designers and developers, builders, a bit more flexibility in the type of buildings that can be built out of timber systems.
And this is very popular now because you easily understand what is the benefit in terms of much lower disruption to the existing tenants, much lower intervention on the foundation and the existing structure, and much less noise and track movements for the neighbors. So all this in a city setting within the typical constraints that are associated with urban infill makes a lot of difference, and it can make a project viable. Can make a project break even, while it doesn't with other construction materials.
And for an office building specifically, there's a lot of buildings with exposed timber which uses the performance route. Do you think many will go down the deemed to satisfy path as well? And what are some of the benefits and negatives of both choices?
Honestly, currently the market likes to expose timber, especially in offices, in commercial spaces, because it sells. And it sells for a reason, not just the aesthetics, which is certainly an important component, but also because people knows that the wellness of people living into a timber office or a timber-clad, rich space is much improved in terms of satisfaction, in terms of less stress, lower blood pressure, lower heart rate. So it is demonstrated by clinical research that living and working in a timber-rich environment is healthier for humans. And so it has become a feature which has a value, and actually we know for sure that some builders and developers who have adopted this already are getting a premium into their rents because there are tenants who know about it. And this has been confirmed also because when we listen to things on the market, we like to prove them, okay? We don't like to rely information, although it's in favor of what we are advocating for, without any sound evidence. So what we did last year was to commission a very thorough and accurate and rather big study, a survey from an independent survey institute, and with an accurate peer review about the wellness in offices, interviewing over 1,000 office workers throughout Australia with a very serious protocol, which is consistent with such a type of research. And the findings were illustrated in a research report that we freely distribute in our website, so it's free for download for everyone. It was presented also in the Venice Biennale with really a lot of success, because it was the first time in the world that something that everybody feels was also measured in a correct and scientific way. So I encourage everyone to look at our wellness study from our website and think how they can leverage this into their own designs.
And I was just adding to that. So the two pathways that are being used in the marketplace is the deemed to satisfy, which is all protected timber, or the performance solution pathway with the exposed timber. Having those exposed timber elements in a building code or the National Construction Code at this time is probably a bit too early and difficult to demonstrate, because it depends on the design of the building, the size of the window openings, the size of the members. There's a range of things that can influence the performance of that building from a fire perspective. The deemed to satisfy is, in one respect, easier to demonstrate because you're basically protecting the timber. It's not exposed. And so from a code change perspective, that was, in quotes, the easier pathway. But people do, and so do I, love the exposed timber. But that's why all of those types of exposed buildings are done as a performance solution. So the fire engineer can look at the structure, look at the layout, and do a fire risk assessment on that. And I think that will continue being done that way for quite a number of years. But there's a whole lot of research work that's been done around the world looking at exposing timber to enable it to be codified to some extent. So we know that research has shown that you can expose at least a wall in a room without changing the fire dynamics within that room. But how big that wall is, its location, that's still being worked through. But in my view, hopefully in the next couple of code changes, we'll be looking to introduce a bit more of that exposure as a deemed to satisfy pathway.
So now there's going to be, now that you can go offices, retail, car parks, public buildings like healthcare, schools, aged care. So there's all these new buildings that we can use the deemed to satisfy approach. What has the most opportunity and potential over the next few years, Paolo?
I think definitely the schools. There is already important trend towards vertical schools here in Australia, because we try to keep the schools as close as possible to where people live and work, and we try to use the space more efficiently, and therefore introducing vertical schools, which are already quite popular in Europe, is a very important, significant trend, which is happening. And I think combining this with the health of a building, which timber can guarantee, and the quickness of construction, which is also a requirement in these locations, will provide the vertical timber schools a very good opportunity. Then aged cares, of course. But for me, the biggest trend in the coming years will be the vertical schools.
And Paolo's mentioned the speed of construction, and one thing that really drives that from a timber perspective is prefabricated building elements. So with our lightweight systems, we can prefabricate all the walls, we can do floor cassette systems, that's all constructed off-site and then delivered, say, to a school site very quickly, and the building gets constructed very quickly without a lot of man-handling and materials on the site. Same with our massive systems, so using cross-laminated timber or laminated veneer lumber panels, that can all be fabricated in a factory and then brought to site on the back of a truck and just erected with lightweight cranes. And so that speed, and I suppose it's the cleanliness of the site. And when we're thinking schools, you don't have all that machinery and equipment there, and keeping the kids and teachers safe, and the work can happen very quickly on site. So I agree with Paolo. I think the vertical schools is a real opportunity, and a lot of these prefabricated building elements, Paolo, they can do a lot of things off-site with the lightweight. Put in the cladding materials can be done off-site, or the plaster systems, they can have windows, etc., pre-installed and then just brought to site and constructed.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned, the speed of construction is a major driver for schools, because they need to stay within the program that has been developed for that. I mean, it's a public investment, so they need really to stay on schedule. And having done some timber schools in Italy, I can only tell you that I've seen the feeling of the teachers, of the personnel, of the kids. They really love it. And so seeing this happening also in Australia is probably for me the biggest satisfaction in the years to come. And look, we come from the timber industry, so we always take for granted the sustainability aspect. For us, it's a given. But for other people, a city planner, a leader in a school, when they discover this, how really sustainable is to build with timber, they love it. And it's a big message to the growing generations that understand it even better than we do and appreciate it very much.
I think sort of one of the things that people don't think about when we talk about sustainability is that you can regrow that timber at least once in your lifetime in terms of the forestry. It takes our softwoods 30 to 35 years to regrow. What other building material can you say that about in terms of from a sustainability
and actually, we have done calculation. What is the amount of building used in like the 9-story Forte building, 23 apartments? It's a little less than 1,000 cubic meters of engineered wood products. This grows in Australian softwood plantations, so plantations, not virgin forest, and just softwood, in less than 2 hours.
Yeah.
And I'd imagine that building codes are a good way of achieving the sustainability goals, say if we're meant to be getting to zero emissions in the next few decades. Do you think this is one of the reasons why going forward building codes around the world are going to continue to allow for increasingly allow for the construction of timber systems and promote or recommend timber systems instead of traditional construction materials?
Look, currently in Australia, our National Construction Code has sustainability as an objective, but doesn't have any formal requirements that you need to achieve. But that will change over time. There are energy efficiency measures, which is all about sustainability and minimising carbon dioxide emissions. One of the things I'd hope that the code would do not too far down the track is look at embodied energy of materials. Unfortunately, at the moment, the codes don't do that in Australia, but it's not that difficult a step to actually put that in as part of overall reduction in CO2 emissions. There are other measures that are introduced, like other rating tools that are available in the marketplace, but they're non-mandatory. But as under the code, like I say, it just has some formal objectives. But hopefully down in the not too distant future, that will be a bit more defined as to what that means.
And an interesting trend is that from the International Construction Code. The International Construction Code is not mandatory in many parts of the world. Nations have their own codes. But it is like a forum in which there is a high-level discussion on what shall be really an agreed and shared approach to the safety of construction. Like we have an agreed and shared approach in the safety of transport, like airplanes and ships, or in mobile phones. They need to have the same standards throughout the world because people move and use them in different countries. So why not a building which is really a living machine? It's an important machine in our safety as we move throughout the world, have the same standards throughout the world. So the International Code Council is something that we shall look at with attention and support to come to an agreed level of standards in building. And interestingly, they have approved timber construction very, very similar to the deemed to satisfy that we have in Australia, up to 18 stories. This is approved. It will be effective in 2021. The codes move prudently and slowly, but it's correct. They have already approved with a limited area of exposed mass timber, as Boris was mentioning, from floors and ceiling up to 12 stories, which is even more than our deemed to satisfy now. And so this is a trend. These people are not, people who don't care about the safety. They do care a lot about the safety of the occupants of the building. They just use engineering in a more correct, rational, and less emotional way. And it is demonstrated by sound engineering, sound design, that a timber building, although it's made of combustible materials, is much safer than other buildings which are poorly designed. And although they use deemed to or considered being non-combustible materials, then they have a result in terms of actual performance in the real fire situation, which is poorer than the requested values. So, it's not the nature of the material which changes radically and totally its behavior in a real fire situation, is the way it is used.
Look, the only thing that I would add to what Paolo was just saying is that International Building Code is already being picked up in the States. So they do have the ability to have these exposed timber buildings up to this 12-storey level, and then they use the fire protection or our deemed to satisfy pathway for buildings up to 18 stories. So, I look from a fire engineering perspective, I look at that as well, going, look, that's probably where we should be moving. And as Paolo was talking, I'm going, well, why couldn't we just adopt the International Building Code here in Australia? Yeah. And the International Building Code that was done, there was a whole lot of fire test work that was done in both the States and in Canada with exposed timber elements to actually form the change in that International Building Code. And as Paolo said, it's not just people thinking, this is a good idea, let's just do it. it's quite a rigorous process where they have a range of people reviewing the submission and questioning and probing the changes. So it took them a while to get those code changes, but they are a step beyond where we are here in Australia at the moment. But so something to keep our eye on as well.
What resources can we expect to be developed over the next few months to help with these designers design to these new code changes?
Yeah, look, we're currently working on a number of design guides, which will be available via the WoodSolutions website. So, as the plug, woodsolutions.com.au, but it's a very effective website with a whole lot of technical information in relation to timber. So with the code change that came out in 2016, again, we said to our building codes people that we would provide technical guidance documentation, which we did. So we're now in the process of updating that guidance document in relation to apartment and hotel buildings. So that's Technical Guide 37. We'll be coming out with Technical Guide 37R, which will be for residential buildings, so these Class 2 and 3 buildings, apartments and hotels. Then we'll have a Guide 37C, which will cover commercial and education buildings. And then we'll have a Guide 37H, which will cover healthcare buildings. So we're probably halfway through the development of those guides. So in the next 2 to 3 months or so, at least by mid-year, we'll have all those technical guides freely available from the WoodSolutions website.
Yeah, that's very, very important because these guides have been so popular among the designers and specifiers that really they deserve to be updated soon and efficiently, which you are doing. On the other hand, for those people who like to have a hands-on experience, we have a demo building, which is a representation in real scale of a mid-rise construction using different materials and components and systems. It's into the Holmes Glen TAFE, and people are really happy when they come and have a hands-on experience. They can touch, they can move, they can also change something if they wish. Some parts of the building are movable, so they can be substituted and changed, and it's also a tool for enabling design teams to make experiments if they wish, not just on paper but also in the real life. So you're welcome to come and visit and touch it.
If you've got a question about wood, the WoodSolutions technical design guides will be able to help. Technical Guide 37 is very relevant to our conversation today, which looks at how to achieve the DTS provisions for Class 2 buildings. And remember, stay tuned for the next episode where we explore the performance solution and the fire engineering for exposed timber.